Introduction. This video is a response to YouTuber King Critical, a self-described gender-critical feminist, commonly known as a TERF, or trans-exclusionary radical feminist. Note that gender-critical feminists typically regard the term TERF as an insulting slur. King Critical does not recognize the validity of transgender identities and non-binary identities, and believes that recognition of trans women in particular is misogynist and, in his words, quote, gender identity extremism, end quote. As a content warning, please note that this video contains transphobic portions of and quotations from King Critical's video, which may cause distress, as well as general and specific discussion of transphobic attitudes and claims. In his video, King Critical was responding to a video by popular progressive YouTuber Shaun, who argued that the late British author Sir Terry Pratchett would have recognized transgender identities as valid and would have supported trans rights. King Critical took the opposite view, arguing against Shaun's case. However, after around an hour of disputing the issue, King Critical himself, after reading the key scene in Pratchett's book to which Shaun was appealing, finally acknowledged that Shaun's interpretation was correct. These are his words.
And again, I want to clarify that Terry Pratchett, I don't think there's any doubt now, is a complete prick. I mean, at the end of the day, it's worth noting that Shaun did prove that Terry Pratchett would have been a, misogynist. So there we go. Like, Terry Pratchett would be probably one of the people talking about how J.K. Rowling is a terrible, awful person.
Consequently, there is no need to rebut King Critical's original argument on this point. He has already conceded he was wrong. Nevertheless, there is still merit in analysing other claims King Critical made and did not concede, especially since they have been raised regularly by other people in discussions of Terry Pratchett's views. In particular, I will examine King Critical's claims about the novelty of the public discussion of trans issues, specifically his claims that Terry Pratchett was not around, quote, for questions about whether or not anybody who says they are a man is a man, and anyone who says they're a woman is a woman, end quote. Quote, for questions about giving puberty blockers to children, end quote. Quote, for whether or not I, as a biological male, should be allowed to go and just lift weights in the women's category because I say I'm a woman, end quote. I will demonstrate that all these claims are untrue. I will also be presenting additional information supporting the view that Terry Pratchett would have affirmed transgender identities and trans rights using Pratchett's own words, and addressing the specific wording of a sentence in the Terry Pratchett book under discussion, which has been published in two forms, differing only in the use of a single pronoun. This short but highly significant sentence appears in some editions of the book as, quote, around him the kitchen worked, end quote, and appears in other copies of the book as, quote, around her the kitchen worked, end quote. The precise meaning of this innocuously worded sentence was crucial to both Shaun's argument and to King Critical's eventual concession to Shaun. If the correct reading is, quote, around him, end quote, then Shaun's argument is valid. But if the correct reading is, quote, around her, end quote, Shaun's argument fails. I will examine the evidence for the difference and argue that, quote, around him, end quote, is the original and authentic wording. This video covers these topics. 1. Rhetorical errors. 2. Issues Pratchett knew about. 3. King Critical concedes. 4. Textual corruption. 5. Pratchett's own words. Use the timestamps in the video description to navigate the content. Rhetorical errors. In this section, we'll see how King Critical makes various rhetorical errors, such as committing logical fallacies and drawing false analogies. His first objection is that describing Terry Pratchett as a supporter of trans rights is like an appeal to authority.
First of all, because it's like an appeal to authority to begin with. Or it's not even an appeal to authority, because like Terry Pratchett isn't an authority. So it's just an appeal to some guy. It's an appeal to some guy. And ultimately to even bother engaging in a debate about it is it's not necessary.
An appeal to authority takes the form X is true because authority figure Y says it is true. However, no one is making such an argument, and no argument even like an appeal to authority was made. King Critical forgets the origin of this dispute, which began when gender-critical feminist Emma Hilton made the claim that Terry Pratchett would not have affirmed trans identities, posting, quote, "Honestly have no idea how anyone can read Pratchett, especially the witches, and think he didn't know what female is and means in the world," end quote. This was immediately disputed by several people, and the public argument over Pratchett's actual position began. So no appeal to Pratchett's authority was ever made, and the first person to make a claim about Pratchett's views on trans issues was actually a gender-critical feminist. The idea that Pratchett was appealed to as an authority in order to validate trans identity and rights simply demonstrates a lack of knowledge of how the discussion emerged. King Critical also took issue with Terry Pratchett's daughter Rhianna, who objected that, quote, "My father would most definitely not be a GC, gender critical, if he was still alive," end quote.
So apparently, what Pratchett's own daughter said should be the only, like, that should be the end of it. Because remember, children always know exactly what it is that their parents would think on every single issue.
This is a straw man. No one claimed that Rhianna Pratchett's view should be taken as authoritative on the basis that children always know exactly what it is their parents would think on every issue. As poor as this argument was, King Critical promptly made it worse.
I mean, just think about this for a second. How many of you watching this, you know, however old you are and however old your parents are, would claim that you could accurately say exactly how your parents would feel about every single issue? Especially, and I want to stress this, one which crosses a lot of standard political divides.
This is equally fallacious, since there is nothing in Rhianna's statement which requires her to know exactly how her parents would feel about every single issue, regardless of whether or not it crosses political divides. Additionally, even if Rhianna cannot know exactly how her parents would feel about every issue, that does not preclude her from knowing what they feel about certain issues in particular. What King Critical needs to do is present evidence that it is not possible for Rhianna to know her own father's view on this specific issue. However, he never does this. King Critical continues.
You know, so you can't say, well, my parent was a Marxist, so they would obviously be, you know, what? Because there aren't real Marxists who are pro-gender identity extremism, but there are people who claim to be Marxists on both sides of the debate. There are people who claim to be conservatives on both sides of the debate. There are people who claim to be liberals on both sides of the debate. So you can't even, like, even if you have a general idea of your parents' political leanings, you still can't come out of that being like, well, therefore I know exactly what my parents think about this. And certainly you can't be like, well, my dad was kind, so obviously he would have agreed with me. It's really stupid.
This is another straw man, since Rhianna did not claim Pratchett's position on trans views was a necessary consequence of his political position, which in fact she never even mentioned. She made no argument even analogous to, my dad was a Marxist, therefore he would have supported trans rights. Nor, for that matter, did she say anything analogous to, my dad was kind, so obviously he would agree with me. King Critical never addresses the actual form of Rhianna's argument, nor does he provide any evidence that it is not possible for her to have the knowledge she claims. Additionally, King Critical's claim that, quote, there aren't real Marxists who are pro-gender identity extremism, end quote, commits the no true Scotsman fallacy. This is particularly ironic, since earlier in his video, King Critical rightly took issue with Shaun's insinuation that journalist Sarah Dittam was not a real journalist because he disagreed with the article she wrote in The Times. Having criticised Shaun for committing the no true Scotsman fallacy, King Critical promptly used it himself. He continues.
So immediately, like, the idea that a child should automatically be taken as the authority on what their parents would have believed is just absurd. I mean, that's what the Mormons are like. Mormons are like, that's like, you're getting into the whole, like, baptizing your your parents into the cult after they've been killed. That's what gender identity extremists have graduated to now. It's always interesting to see exactly how far, like which cult are they going to be looking towards for inspiration next. Oh, this person's going to baptize their family member into the cult today.
There are several problems here. The first is that King Critical provides no reason for why, generally speaking, a child should not be automatically taken as the authority on what their parents believed. The child is, after all, in the best position to know their own parents. However, even if we accept that a child's opinion should not be accepted as absolutely authoritative, is there any rational reason to conclude that they would not be at least reliably informed on their parents' own opinions? In particular, King Critical provides no reason why a child should not be taken as far more authoritative on the beliefs of their parents than someone who never knew their parents personally at all. This is a point Shaun raised, to which King Critical never responded. Should Rhianna Pratchett's understanding of her father's beliefs be taken as less authoritative than the opinion of someone who never knew or met him? Does King Critical believe gender-critical feminist Emma Hilton's understanding of Pratchett's view of transgender issues is more likely to be correct than those of Rhianna Pratchett? If so, on what basis? If not, then why even argue the point? The second is that in this particular case, Rhianna Pratchett is only a child in the sense of being Pratchett's daughter, and is, in fact, a grown woman. Consequently, she shouldn't really be referred to as a child, as if her mental state and knowledge of her father is only at the level of a teenager at most. Referring to her as a child infantilizes her and gives a very misleading impression. We could legitimately conclude that a 10-year-old might not be aware of their parents' views on transgender issues, but it's far less likely that a 44-year-old woman would be equally ignorant. Thirdly, the comparison with the Mormons is a false analogy. The Mormon practice of baptism for the dead involves retroactively baptizing people who were known not to believe in the Mormon faith while they were alive, which is precisely why they are baptized after death. This practice is actually predicated on knowing the beliefs of one's parents or even ancestors, while King Critical's argument relies on mature adults being ignorant of the beliefs of their own parents. In the Mormon faith, the parents who are baptized are not being retroactively converted, nor are their original authentic beliefs being erased and being replaced with the beliefs of their descendants, or beliefs which their descendants wish them to have. In fact, Mormon doctrine teaches that the spirits of those whose descendants baptize them in this way may choose to accept or reject the baptism. There is no valid analogy here with a 44-year-old woman reporting on the beliefs of her own father, who died merely 6 years prior. It seems likely that King Critical is simply uninformed on the doctrines of the Latter-day Saints, or Mormons. I later discovered that this specific point was actually made by someone commenting on King Critical's video. They wrote, quote, "Baptizing the dead in Mormonism doesn't come from the idea of knowing what the dead person believed or wanted," end quote. And, quote, "In theory, they would have the ability to accept or deny the ordinance on the other side," end quote. And finally concluding, quote, "It's really not comparable to this situation at all," end quote. In response, King Critical wrote, quote, "It's comparable in one key way. In both cases, we're talking about nonsense belief systems," end quote. This abandons his original analogy and attempts to say something different. King Critical continues.
No, you can't say that any child knows what it is that their parents will believe about really any issue, but especially an issue that's quite complicated, unless you have a specific example of them actually saying something on it.
Again, it should be remembered that by using the word child, King Critical is distracting from the fact that in this case, we're talking about a 44-year-old woman's knowledge of her own father. Regardless, he gives us no reason to believe that Rhianna Pratchett would not have any specific information, experiences, or examples which would reliably inform her concerning her own father's views on trans issues. King Critical continues.
Now, the other thing I just want to point out is also how pointless this is, because if Terry Pratchett had actually said that he agreed with gender-critical feminists, if he'd said that he disagreed with the idea of, gender identity extremism, with the idea that anybody who says they're a woman is a woman, and Rhianna knew that, and she saw this debate going on, what are the chances, you think, that she would come out and say, oh yeah, actually, yeah, my dad, yeah, really would have agreed with the people who, are gender critical? I suspect she would lie. Don't you? And the point I'm making here is not to speculate that she is lying. I think it's far more likely she doesn't know. But the point I'm making is even if she did know, she would only say the thing that's to her political advantage and to the political advantage of the cult that she belongs to.
The first problem with this is that King Critical never provides any reason for claiming Rhianna could not know what her own father thought about trans issues. The second is that he has very obviously set up a kind of Morton's fork, which is a form of false dichotomy in which either choice results in support for his own case. In order for this argument to be taken seriously, King Critical must provide evidence that the only two possibilities are that Rhianna cannot know her father's opinion on the issue, or that even if she did know, she would lie about it if it contradicted her own position. Of course, we know he will never provide such evidence because we already know that, ironically, at the end of his own video, King Critical is compelled to abandon this false dichotomy, having suddenly realized that there are sources of information about Pratchett's views other than Rhianna, which confirm exactly what she has said, that Terry Pratchett did indeed believe that trans identities were valid. What Pratchett knew about. In this section, we'll look at various statements King Critical makes which are factually incorrect. Let's start with his claim that the public discourse around transgender issues only really began when British author J.K. Rowling made her gender-critical stance public, long after Terry Pratchett was dead.
Given that the argument is against contemporary trans activism, that is a debate which, honestly, has only really existed since kind of, really the 90s with Judith Butler and that was really when kind of gender identity extremism really kicked into gear. Obviously, the medical industrial establishment when it comes to what was called transsexualism existed for a decent while before that. But significantly, the debate only really became prominent when J.K. Rowling started tweeting, which was after Terry Pratchett died.
King Critical provides no evidence for this claim, and I suspect that his statements here are actually a reflection of his own personal experiences with trans issues, and when he first became aware of them. Anyone older than 30 should be aware that what he says here simply isn't true. One of the most obvious illustrations of why this isn't true is found in 2014, the year before Terry Pratchett died. A front cover article in the Time magazine entitled "The Transgender Tipping Point, America's Next Civil Rights Frontier" identified explicitly the fact that discussions around trans identity had already become mainstream. The article's entire argument was that the trans issues, which had previously been largely confined to academic discourse or minority communities on the social fringe, were now part of regular public discourse. Katie Steinmetz, the article's author, cited Elizabeth Race, teacher at the University of Oregon, who explained that while in the late 90s many of her gender politics students, quote, had no clue what the word transgender meant, end quote, in recent years, quote, nearly everyone who enters her classroom already knows the term, end quote. Steinmetz's article usefully identifies certain trans issues which had already become part of mainstream discourse by 2014. One was puberty blockers, which she said were being used by, quote, many trans people, end quote. Another was the use of bathrooms by trans people. Steinmetz cited a law in California which guaranteed a trans person's right to use the bathroom corresponding to their personal gender identity. Another was the issue of trans people in sports. Steinmetz wrote, quote, at least a dozen other states have instituted policies that allow students to play on the sports team that aligns with their gender identity, end quote. Steinmetz also pointed out that 5 states had prohibited health insurance plans excluding treatment related to gender transition, and 18 states, quote, currently have non-discrimination measures that include gender identity, end quote. That's quite a list of trans-positive progress, all well established by the year before Terry Pratchett died. I'd like to highlight these in particular. 1. Transgender people being treated with puberty blockers. 2. Transgender people permitted to use gendered bathrooms matching their personal identity. 3. Transgender athletes permitted to compete in gender categories matching their personal identity. 4. Anti-discrimination legislation created to protect transgender people. Keep this list in mind as we watch the next part of King Critical's argument.
The point is, the debate, which exists even though you think it doesn't because you are not smart, the debate hasn't existed that long. It's relatively new. And Terry Pratchett was not contemporaneous, I hope that's the right way to say it, with the debate. Terry Pratchett wasn't around for the current debate. Terry Pratchett wasn't around for questions about giving puberty blockers to children, for questions about whether or not anybody who says that they're a man is a man and anybody who says they're a woman is a woman. Terry Pratchett wasn't around for whether or not I, as a biological male, should be allowed to go and just lift weights in the women's category because I say I'm a woman. Terry Pratchett was not around for these discussions being mainstream. So it makes complete sense to say that he wouldn't have been able to give an opinion on these issues.
Even only on the basis of the Time article cited previously, it is clear how completely wrong these statements are. Virtually every issue King Critical claims didn't exist while Terry Pratchett was alive had in fact been very widely discussed in the mainstream public arena and in many cases had been addressed with government legislation by at least a year before Terry Pratchett died. So Pratchett was in fact around for the discussion of these issues, and the insinuation that he, quote, wouldn't have been able to give an opinion on these issues, end quote, because they weren't on the public radar, is simply false. Now, let's suppose that at this point I move the goalposts in King Critical's favour to steelman his argument as much as possible. I'll acknowledge that 2014 is pretty late, Pratchett died the following year, and he didn't produce any books during that period, and the Pratchett book specifically under discussion by both Shaun and King Critical was published a decade earlier in 2003. So even if we acknowledged Pratchett was technically around when these issues had become mainstream, we might still argue that we can't expect to find support for these issues in a book he wrote a full 10 years earlier. We might still argue that these issues certainly were not mainstream by 2003, and we might consequently conclude that Pratchett, in King Critical's words, quote, wouldn't have been able to give an opinion on these issues, end quote. Will this steelman form of King Critical's argument withstand scrutiny? It's much stronger than his actual case, so it has a better chance. Let's examine the historical record against the claims he made in this steelman form. I'll quote each individual claim and then scrutinize it in historical context. Claim 1. King Critical claimed Pratchett was not around, quote, for questions about whether or not anybody who says they're a man is a man and anybody who says they're a woman is a woman, end quote. In fact, in 2001, an Australian family court ruling affirmed that Kevin, a trans man, could legally marry Jennifer, a cis heterosexual woman. Note that both names are pseudonyms assigned by the judge, Chief Justice Richard Chisholm. The significance of this ruling was that this recognized transgender identity as legally valid. As Chisholm noted, quote, a valid marriage for the purpose of the Marriage Act 1961 must be between a man and a woman, end quote. Consequently, the legal ruling that Kevin could marry Jennifer necessarily concluded that Kevin was a man in the eyes of the law. In Chisholm's own words, quote, the essential issue is whether Kevin was a man on the date of the marriage, end quote. Chisholm ruled that he was, thus confirming the legal legitimization of transgender identity in Australia. Chisholm also noted that Kevin had already received a new passport identifying his sex as male and a new public health care card with his male name, recording him as the husband of Jennifer. Chisholm further noted that Kevin was already, quote, referred to and treated as a man by a number of people and organizations, end quote, citing banks, clubs, Kevin's employer, public authorities, and the Australian Tax Office. The case was widely reported in the media, and in 2005, the popular Australian investigative journalism TV series Four Corners addressed it in considerable detail, demonstrating how prominent trans issues had become in the mainstream by that time. Before we leave this case, it should be noted that throughout the case, Chief Justice Chisholm deliberately referred to Kevin as a husband and with the male pronoun he, and explained that this was a matter of courtesy. It was an unexpectedly sensitive gesture from an authority figure. Now, that was in 2001, well before Pratchett published Monstrous Regiment, the book under discussion by Shaun and King Critical. Still, while I am steel-manning King Critical's argument, I'll acknowledge that this was a legal case in Australia, and while it absolutely was a matter of mainstream public discourse and established groundbreaking case law in support of trans rights in Australia, overturning several previous anti-trans rulings during the 1990s, its relevance to the UK could be questioned. So let's turn to the UK. What was happening there around this time? Well, interestingly enough, something very similar. In 2002, on the basis of the European Convention on Human Rights, Articles 8 and 12, the European Court of Human Rights ruling Goodwin and I versus United Kingdom, 2002, concluded that a trans person has the right to change the sex recorded on their birth certificate, and that the UK government was consequently legally bound to recognise transgender identities. This compelled the UK to enact its own law, and the Gender Recognition Act was proposed in 2003 and passed in 2004. This act allowed anyone in the UK aged at least 18 to apply for a gender recognition certificate on the basis of either, quote, living in the other gender or having changed gender under the law of a country or territory outside the United Kingdom, end quote. Note in particular the wording, quote, living in the other gender, end quote. This is implicit recognition of an individual's authority to self-identify their gender. There are no biological, psychological, or medical criteria to meet. You simply have to live in the other gender. Now, let's remember that this act entered legislation in 2004, having been proposed in 2003, as a consequence of a legal ruling in 2002. Remember also that the Pratchett book under discussion by Shaun and King Critical was published in 2003. This means that Pratchett was writing it at the same time that this very public discussion was taking place in the UK, and as this piece of historic legislation was being discussed in Parliament. In light of these facts, a heavy burden of evidence rests on anyone claiming, as King Critical did, that Pratchett wasn't around, quote, for questions about whether or not anybody who says they're a man is a man, and anybody who says they're a woman is a woman, end quote. Pratchett was literally writing a book specifically addressing gender and identity at the same time that the UK Parliament was publicly debating an act which would provide legal recognition of an individual's self-identified gender. Ironically, it's quite likely that King Critical himself is simply too young to remember the public discourse around this legislation. Perhaps he just wasn't around for it. There is plenty of evidence that this issue continued to remain current in public discourse in subsequent years in Australia, the UK, and the US. In fact, in Australia, by 2002, every state and territory except for one, Victoria, had passed legislation permitting any unmarried transgender individual who had undergone, quote, sexual reassignment surgery or procedures, end quote, to have their legal sex changed to match their personal identity. The issue continued to remain in the public eye in the US, UK, and Australia throughout the following years through a combination of media reporting, educational materials for public schools, and law reform. Claim 2. King Critical claimed Pratchett, quote, wasn't around for questions about giving puberty blockers to children, end quote. Well, that's not true either. That particular debate was already in the public eye long before Pratchett's book Monstrous Regiment was published. In 1996, a documentary on the UK's Channel 4 TV network covered transgender treatment in Amsterdam. In particular, the documentary focused on a number of teenagers who had been receiving puberty blockers as early as 13 in order to address their body dysmorphia and help them transition to their self-identified gender. The following year, in 1997, an article in the Sunday Times, a conservative British broadsheet newspaper, reported that, quote, children as young as 14 are receiving sex change treatment on the NHS, end quote, adding that this had provoked much debate within the medical profession. This article, in one of Britain's largest newspapers, with a massive circulation of 1.3 million copies a week at the time, demonstrates that the discussion of puberty blockers as treatment for transgender children was already in the public eye at least 6 years before Pratchett published the book under discussion by Shaun and King Critical. The newspaper article stated specifically that some children, quote, receive drugs to block the onset of puberty, followed by hormones to help develop the characteristics of their preferred gender, end quote, and cited opinions by medical care professionals both for and against the practice. Meanwhile, by 2003, the issue of puberty blockers for transgender teens was also a matter of public discourse in other countries. On the 13th of September 2003, Dutch daily morning newspaper De Volkskrant, which has a very firmly centrist political stance, reported on the growing number of teens in the Netherlands who were identifying as trans. The article described the work of a local support group as well as the personal experiences of half a dozen transgender teens or preteens, and explained that such children, quote, can be prescribed hormones as well as puberty blockers to begin their outward change to more closely match their chosen sex, end quote. This same discussion was also taking place in Australia. In 2004, a 13-year-old identified by the pseudonym Alex sought court approval for a treatment of puberty blockers in order to affirm their identity as male. In this case, Chief Justice Alastair Nicholson supported Alex's application, issuing a ruling in which he authorised, quote, the administration of hormonal treatment as determined from time to time by the attending physicians without specifying the timing and nature of the treatment, end quote. By 2005, puberty blockers were already a typical treatment for transitioning teens in Australia. Claim 3. King Critical claimed Pratchett, quote, wasn't around for whether or not I, as a biological male, should be allowed to go and just lift weights in the women's category because I say I'm a woman, end quote. This is a particularly extraordinary claim given the extent to which this issue was being debated while Pratchett was writing the book under discussion. As early as 1996, the International Olympic Committee World Conference on Women and Health resolved, quote, to discontinue the current process of gender verification during the Olympic Games, end quote, a proposal which was ratified in 1999. These new rules were already established by the 2000 Sydney Summer Olympic Games. At this time, 5 of the international Olympic sports federations still required gender verification testing at their own events, one of which was the Weightlifting Federation. However, in 2004, just 1 year after Monstrous Regiment was published, the International Olympic Organization introduced a new ruling permitting transgender athletes to compete in the Olympics in the gender category of their legally recognized identity. Before we leave this section, although King Critical didn't mention it in his list of claims, it's worth pointing out that the issue of transgender people and bathrooms had also been well aired in public discourse for years before Pratchett's novel was published in 2003. Public articles on the subject can be found online, dating at least as early as 1997, showing schools, universities, civil liberties movements, and government departments all addressing the issue. Let's return briefly to King Critical's comments before we move on.
Certainly, I think, a lot of people have not lived to see this debate become as mainstream as it has now. And really, I would say yes, that it's only really with J.K. Rowling having tweeted about this and really brought this issue into the public sphere that you can actually kind of make a point about it.
I find this particularly ironic given it seems unlikely King Critical himself is even old enough to have seen this discussion commence, and consequently hasn't really been around long enough to have personally witnessed very much of the so-called debate at all. This would explain why he is so unaware of the actual history and extent of the mainstream discussion of trans issues. King Critical concedes. Finally, Right near the end of his video, after an hour of persistent disagreement with Shaun's understanding of Terry Pratchett, King Critical finds himself unable to contest the argument Shaun makes from one of the last scenes in Terry Pratchett's book, Monstrous Regiment, and concedes the case.
An interesting thing happens. Jackram's pronouns in the narration change back. Polly paused when she got to the door. Jackram had turned her chair to the fire and had settled back. Around him, the kitchen worked.
Okay, so there we go. That's her answer, I guess. Congratulations, Shaun. You have won. Terry Pratchett was a misogynist. Because Terry Pratchett says, oh, internalized misogyny. Must be a man. So yeah, Terry Pratchett's a misogynist. There we go. So I guess, like, Shaun won the video? Well done, Shaun. You actually, you convinced me. Terry Pratchett would probably not be on J.K. Rowling's side. Terry Pratchett would be just another misogynistic man. Don't really know how to feel about that. It's not really surprising, is it? It's kind of like Shaun said, you know, once somebody shows themselves to be a bigot, it's not really surprising if they're a bigot.
It's important to understand exactly what Shaun is saying. He is not arguing that the character Jackram was necessarily intended by Pratchett to be a trans man. What he is arguing is that, as far as Pratchett is concerned, a person's gender identity is a product of their own self-analysis and self-interpretation, and that consequently Jackram's personal identification as a man is sufficient to make Jackram a man. This is precisely the position King Critical was opposing. Unfortunately for King Critical, his concession that Shaun was correct in his interpretation of Pratchett's position means that the vast majority of his own video was essentially a waste of time. He had argued solidly that Pratchett wasn't around for the discussion of any of the contemporary transgender issues, that Pratchett's own views on transgender issues could not even be known, and that even Pratchett's own daughter Rhianna was probably ignorant of them. However, at this point, he was compelled to discard all that previous argumentation and acknowledge that Shaun was correct all along. Textual corruption. At this point, it is necessary to address a potential flaw in Shaun's argument. Remember that his case for Pratchett's recognition of the validity of transgender identity rests on the passage in Pratchett's book Monstrous Regiment, in which Captain Jackram, a self-identified woman who has previously been referred to as a man by herself, other characters, and the narrator, now chooses to continue to live as a man. The relevant sentences, as quoted by Shaun, read thus, quote, Polly paused when she got to the door. Jackram had turned her chair to the fire and had settled back. Around him, the kitchen worked, end quote. Shaun's argument correctly picks up on the narrator's change from the personal pronoun her, used to describe Jackram in the first of these sentences, to the personal pronoun him, used to describe Jackram in the very next sentence. In Shaun's words, quote, the narration knows the truth. Jackram isn't a woman pretending to be a man at this point. He's just a man, end quote. As we have seen, this argument was so clearly decisive that King Critical himself conceded the point. However, given that Shaun's argument rests on Pratchett's use of a single pronoun, we need to address the fact that this pronoun does not appear in certain editions of the book. In an electronic edition published by HarperCollins in 2007, instead of reading, quote, around him the kitchen worked, end quote, the text reads, quote, around her the kitchen worked, end quote. This reading completely undermines Shaun's argument. However, in an electronic edition by the curiously appropriately named publisher Transworld Digital in 2008, the text reads, quote, around him the kitchen worked, end quote, supporting Shaun's case. Which is the original reading? There is clear evidence that, quote, around him the kitchen worked, end quote, is the correct reading. The electronic edition published by Transworld Digital contains a publication statement that the book was, quote, first published in Great Britain in 2003 by Doubleday, an imprint of Transworld Publishers, end quote. So Transworld were the original publishers of the print book, which they subsequently converted into an electronic form. Since they published the print copy, we can rest assured that their electronic copy is an accurate representation of the original text. Unfortunately, despite much searching, I haven't been able to find any reason why this particular edition of an American publication of the book contained an alternative wording. Strangely enough, it doesn't seem like this is well known, and I've only found one blog on which it was even mentioned. Pratchett's own words. Recent discussions of Pratchett's views of gender and sexuality have often quoted from his books, but have typically not cited his own direct statements on these subjects outside the confines of his literary works. In this section, I will examine Pratchett's own actions and statements in order to see if they contribute to our understanding of Pratchett's views on transgender issues. Most of Pratchett's public statements only provide indirect information about his views. In 2011, Pratchett was one of 50 public figures who signed a letter to the Guardian newspaper in the UK, protesting against a state visit of the Pope, objecting to a number of the Catholic Church's religious and social policies. These included, quote, opposing equal rights for lesbians, gay, bisexual, and transgender people, end quote. However, it could be argued that this is still not an explicit statement on transgender rights specifically. In 2003, Pratchett was interviewed by Tom Shard, presenter at Fast Forward, Contemporary Science Fiction, a monthly TV series in the US covering works in the sci-fi genre. Although his interview spent only a couple of minutes on Pratchett's latest book, Monstrous Regiment, Pratchett confirmed that the book was intended to address the issue of, as Shard put it, quote, what is one's sexual identity, end quote. However, this mention was only brief, and the interview did not provide any direct statements from Pratchett on his own views concerning the subject. Still, we can go back even further in time, 2 years before Monstrous Regiment was even published. In 2001, Pratchett was interviewed by staff from the e-zine Faster Than Light, self-described as covering, quote, transgender and GLBT science fiction, fantasy, and horror, end quote. The very fact that Pratchett was approached for such an interview demonstrates that the FTL staff recognized these themes in his work, a fact which Pratchett himself confirmed. During the interview, Pratchett was asked why he chose to raise and discuss, quote, transgender topics, end quote, in his novels, and if this was, quote, motivated by political activism of your side for gay or transgender rights, political experiences, or you being witness of struggles of transgendered friends or relatives, end quote. Pratchett replied firmly, quote, none of the above, end quote, explaining that his novel's treatment of these issues emerged naturally from the social context of the fantasy world he had built. Significantly, this was an acknowledgement that his books were specifically addressing these topics. Pratchett's own views on transgender identity became even clearer as he continued, saying, quote, the people I know who are gay and one transgendered, I think, like the dwarves, I don't ask people what they're not prepared to volunteer, are mostly within SF fantasy fandom, end quote. This not only demonstrated that Pratchett recognized transgender people, but also that he considered people's gender identity a private matter which was no one else's business, and which is to be disclosed only at an individual's personal discretion. He added that the sci-fi and fantasy fandom, quote, appears at least to be quite amiable about people's sexuality, so long as they don't act like a jerk, end quote, a position he clearly took himself. Pratchett was then asked if he thought, quote, transgender characters are more common and more accepted in science fiction fantasy than in other genres, end quote, to which he replied, quote, as above, without a shadow of a doubt, end quote. Again, the context demonstrates that this is clearly a position with which Pratchett himself approved and which he himself held. Subsequently, the interviewer commented, quote, so far all your transgender characters have been male to female oriented, or female to female if one chooses that view, end quote, before asking, quote, can we expect some of the other direction, end quote. Note that since transgender is an umbrella term covering a range of definitions, it isn't clear precisely what either the interviewer or Pratchett understood this to mean, but the interviewer's use of the term, quote, male to female oriented, end quote, refers at least to a transition in gender performativity or expression, if not in actual gender identity. Significantly, Pratchett did not reject the statement that his works contained transgender characters, but rather explained how they develop organically from the environments of his narrative, rather than being specifically planned as deliberate inclusions. Pratchett also made a comment which revealed he was very well aware that some people might miss the underlying messages of his books. When the interviewer asked him how readers respond to, quote, your use of such protagonists, end quote, asking if reader letters were, quote, more positive or more negative, end quote, Pratchett replied that, quote, those interested in what is going on write very positively. Those who aren't don't notice, end quote. This not only demonstrates that gender non-conforming characters, as well as characters who could be described as transgender under certain definitions of the term, actually exist in Pratchett's books, but that he includes them in such a way that they will be recognized by people who are members of or familiar with gender non-conforming communities, whereas they will be overlooked by people who are less sensitive to these issues. This reinforces the fact that Pratchett's treatment of gender non-conforming characters, and in particular transgender issues, is best interpreted by people within these communities, and people outside them, or even antagonistic to them, will be less able to even notice them, and far less likely to interpret them correctly. This is particularly relevant to the current discussion. Conclusion. This video has provided evidence that King Critical's commentary on Shaun's video 1. Contains serious rhetorical errors. 2. Presents transgender history inaccurately. 3. Recognizes Pratchett as a transgender ally. This video has also provided evidence that Pratchett certainly was a transgender ally, included transgender themes in his work, and at least one transgender character, and held views directly contradicting the gender-critical position. Additionally, it has demonstrated the importance of assessing an author's work in detail before drawing conclusions about their views, especially on complex subjects. A deeper analysis of gender and sexuality in Pratchett's literary works would require a completely separate video, which I may produce at a later date. For anyone interested in researching that particular topic, the best and most recent academic treatment I have read is a bachelor thesis entitled Gender in the Work of Terry Pratchett, published in 2021 by Magdalena Jaraskova of Masaryk University in the Czech Republic. The focus on Pratchett's development of these themes over time makes Jaraskova's thesis unique. Finally, I'd like to thank my generous patrons, Dusty Bob, The Boots Are On, Elias Asvig, Duran Barnett, Alexander Curzon, Shaun A. Young, Andy Chaos, TBLTP, Thors, Fake Name, Niels Rethelin, Judge Sabo, Matthew Simmerall, Martin T., Ben Lindquist, John Larkin, Jack C., Ezekiel Stacy, Love You More, Noah French, and Aaron Johnson. Please contact me if I ever pronounce your name incorrectly.